Welcome back to Hopetales, where real moments of courage turn ordinary flights into unforgettable stories. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the runway, its engines settling into a steady rhythm as the city below shrank into patterns of light and shadow. For most of the 275 passengers on board, this was just another routine flight, a brief chapter between departure and destination. Safety cards were skimmed, seatbelts clicked, and attention drifted toward screens, books, and sleep. At 35,000 feet, calm felt permanent, almost guaranteed. Seat 12C was occupied by a woman who did not share that illusion. She sat upright, hands resting neatly in her lap, eyes following the subtle movements of the cabin rather than the entertainment system in front of her. Her posture suggested alertness, not fear, as if she carried an awareness that extended beyond her seat. The hum of the aircraft felt familiar to her, not comforting but understandable. She noticed small details others ignored: a slight delay in cabin announcements, a flight attendant pausing longer than usual near the cockpit door. The way turbulence felt different from earlier flights, she remembered. Up front, behind the reinforced cockpit door, the flight deck was quiet. Instruments glowed softly, painting the pilots' faces in green and amber light. The aircraft was cruising perfectly within parameters, its autopilot maintaining altitude and course with mechanical precision. Yet something was changing, subtly at first, like a crack forming beneath a smooth surface. One of the pilots leaned back in his seat, pressing a hand briefly against his chest. His breathing shifted, uneven and shallow, unnoticed by the cabin behind him. The co-pilot glanced sideways, sensing something was off. But before instinct could turn into action, the moment slipped forward uncontrollably. The pilot's body slumped, his hands sliding away from the controls, his consciousness vanishing without warning. At 35,000 feet, there was no dramatic sound, no alarm yet, just silence, heavy and dangerous. The aircraft continued forward, obedient to its systems, unaware that the human judgment guiding it had faltered. The co-pilot reacted, reaching out, attempting to stabilize the situation. But the sudden responsibility weighed heavily. Procedures raced through his mind, layered with urgency and fear he was trained to suppress. Outside the cockpit, nothing had changed. Passengers remained unaware, suspended in a fragile bubble of normalcy. Seatbelt signs remained steady. Drinks were still being served. In seat 12C, the woman felt it before anyone told her. A subtle shift in cabin pressure, almost imperceptible, tugged at her senses. Her gaze lifted toward the front of the plane, her focus narrowing. She had learned long ago to trust that instinctive tightening in her chest, the quiet warning that surfaced when systems failed and seconds mattered. Her thoughts did not race. They aligned. She recalled long nights, spent studying flight manuals. She was never officially required to know. Memories surfaced of simulators, emergency scenarios, systems designed to save lives when humans faltered. She was not a pilot, not officially, but knowledge has a way of remaining useful long after its original purpose fades. A faint tension rippled through the cabin as turbulence brushed against the fuselage. A few passengers shifted in their seats. Somewhere behind her, a child stirred. Still, no one panicked because no one knew. In the cockpit, the co-pilot initiated emergency protocols, his voice steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. He needed assistance, clarity, time. Time, however, was already slipping away. The aircraft drifted slightly off its optimal path. Autopilot compensated, but it could not make decisions. It could not assess a collapsing human or anticipate cascading failures. It could only follow instructions already given. A flight attendant approached the cockpit door, her expression tight, movements controlled but urgent. The reality was beginning to leak outward, threatening the fragile calm of the cabin. Procedures dictated what came next. But procedures never accounted for fear moving faster than instructions. In seat 12C, the woman unbuckled her seatbelt. Her movement was deliberate, almost invisible in its calmness. She stood, steadying herself, against the seat back in front of her as the aircraft vibrated, lightly beneath her feet. A flight attendant noticed and raised a hand, ready to ask her to sit down, but hesitated. Something in the woman's eyes suggested purpose rather than defiance. The woman stepped into the aisle, her heartbeat steady, her breathing controlled. She felt the weight of the aircraft around her, the lives it carried, the thin margin separating routine flight from irreversible disaster. 275 people were bound together by metal, fuel, and trust, unaware that trust was about to be tested. She moved forward as another ripple of turbulence passed through the cabin. Murmurs began to rise, curiosity brushing against concern. The illusion of normalcy cracked, just enough to let uncertainty in. At the cockpit door, the flight attendant whispered urgently, her voice barely contained. The woman listened, absorbing fragments, assembling a picture that confirmed what her instincts had already warned her about. A pilot was down. The situation was unstable. Time mattered more than authority. She did not hesitate. Her hand lifted, calm and steady, as she explained what she knew, not with arrogance, but with clarity shaped by preparation. Her presence shifted the air around them. The flight attendant's fear softened into something else, cautious hope. Behind them, the cabin held its breath without knowing why. Inside the cockpit, alarms began to flicker, quiet warnings escalating toward louder demands. The co-pilot's focus fractured under the pressure of monitoring systems, communicating with control, and managing a medical emergency simultaneously. Every second stretched thinner than the last. The woman stepped closer to the door, feeling the weight of a decision forming. This was not about bravery. It was about responsibility. Knowledge unused was useless. Experience ignored was wasted. She understood the risk, the scrutiny, the consequences if she failed. But she also understood what would happen if no one acted. At 35,000 feet, gravity did not forgive hesitation. As the cockpit door opened, a line was crossed that could never be undone. The woman from seat 12C stepped into a space few passengers ever see, her shadow falling across glowing instruments and urgent faces. The aircraft surged forward through empty sky, carrying 275 lives toward an uncertain future. And in that moment, without applause or permission, everything began to change. The cockpit felt smaller than it looked from the outside, compressed by urgency and consequence. Panels of illuminated instruments surrounded the woman as she stepped fully inside, each gauge and screen alive with information that never slept. The scent of electronics and recycled air mixed with something sharper, a trace of fear that no ventilation system could remove. The unconscious pilot remained slumped in his seat, secured by harnesses that now seemed inadequate against the gravity of the situation. The aircraft continued forward, slicing through thin air at cruising speed, indifferent to the human crisis unfolding within its command center. The woman's eyes moved quickly, not frantically, across the controls. Her mind shifted into a mode she had not used in years, one shaped by repetition, discipline, and worst-case scenarios imagined long before they ever became real. Altitude steady. Speed within range. Autopilot engaged. Systems nominal for now. The aircraft was stable, but stability without oversight was a fragile illusion. The co-pilot remained upright, hands active. Attention pulled in too many directions at once. Medical checks, system monitoring, communication protocols, contingency planning. Even with training, the burden of solo command pressed heavily. Fatigue was not physical. It was cognitive. The exhaustion of making decisions where no margin for error existed. The woman positioned herself carefully, mindful not to disrupt anything unintentionally. She understood the unspoken hierarchy of the cockpit, the importance of coordination rather than dominance. This was not a moment for ego. It was a moment for precision. Outside, clouds drifted past the windshield like slow-moving mountains, serene and uncaring. Sunlight reflected off the aircraft's nose, bathing the cockpit in a deceptive calm. Somewhere behind them, passengers shifted in their seats, still largely unaware, still trusting that someone, somewhere was in control. The woman assessed the unconscious pilot next, breathing shallow but present, pulse weak but detectable. Time was critical, but survival remained possible. Every second without full capacity increased risk, not just to him, but to everyone on board. She redirected her attention to the instruments again, prioritizing what mattered most: flight path, fuel status, weather ahead. The aircraft was approaching a region of increasing atmospheric instability, mild on radar now, but capable of escalating quickly. A single pilot managing both flight and crisis would soon be overwhelmed. The decision solidified within her. Her hands hovered near the controls, not touching yet, respecting boundaries even as urgency demanded action. She recalculated mentally, revisiting procedures stored deep in memory. autopilot modes, manual override conditions, redundancies designed for moments like this. When humans failed and systems needed human guidance in return, the co-pilot's posture shifted subtly as he registered her competence. Tension did not vanish, but it redistributed. Responsibility, when shared, became survivable. The woman adjusted her position, ensuring clear visibility of primary flight displays. Her movements were economical, free of hesitation. This was not improvisation. It was execution. Beyond the cockpit door, whispers began to spread. A flight attendant moved through the aisle with practiced calm, but eyes followed her, searching for answers she could not yet provide. Anxiety crept quietly, feeding on uncertainty rather than noise. A slight vibration passed through the aircraft as it encountered uneven air. The autopilot compensated instantly, but the change reinforced a truth the woman already knew. Conditions would not remain ideal forever. The margin for error was shrinking. She reviewed emergency diversion options mentally, mapping nearby airports, runway lengths, terrain, weather patterns. Every possibility carried risk. Staying airborne too long increased exposure. Descending too quickly introduced new dangers. The correct decision was not obvious, only necessary. Her breathing remained steady as she leaned closer to the panel, adjusting settings with deliberate care. The aircraft responded smoothly, obedient to informed input. The sense of connection between human and machine returned, fragile but real. The unconscious pilot stirred slightly, a faint movement that suggested life pushing back against darkness. Relief flickered briefly before discipline suppressed it. Hope could not replace action. The co-pilot focused on external coordination, trusting the woman to manage internal stability. This silent agreement formed without words, built on competence rather than familiarity. In emergencies, trust often emerged faster than fear. The aircraft's trajectory shifted subtly, aligning with a safer corridor through the sky. Nothing dramatic, nothing passengers could feel, but the change mattered. It bought time for systems to hold, time for decisions to mature. The woman checked fuel calculations again, recalibrating based on the new path. Numbers aligned. Possibility remained. Behind them, the cabin lights glowed softly. A baby cried briefly, then settled. A man glanced at his watch, impatient but unconcerned. Life continued inside the metal tube, oblivious to how close it hovered to chaos. Another alert flickered, minor but insistent. The woman acknowledged it calmly, preventing escalation before it demanded attention. Prevention was quieter than correction and far safer. Sweat formed lightly at her temples, unnoticed and unimportant. Adrenaline flowed, but control remained absolute. Panic was a luxury reserved for those without responsibility. She glanced once more at the unconscious pilot, then back to the instruments. This was no longer a temporary assist. This was a transfer of fate. At 35,000 feet, the woman from seat 12C had crossed an invisible boundary, from passenger to protector, from observer to operator. The aircraft moved forward through open sky, guided now by a balance of human resolve and engineered resilience, and, though no one behind the cockpit door yet understood it, the flight's survival no longer depended on what went wrong, but on how far courage and preparation could carry them before time finally ran out. The aircraft began its gradual descent, not dramatic enough to alarm the cabin, yet deliberate enough to signal a shift in fate. Altitude numbers rolled downward in controlled increments, each one marking a step, away from cruising safety and toward a confrontation with reality. The sky outside deepened in color, clouds thickening ahead like a quiet warning rather than an obstacle. Inside the cockpit, time compressed. The woman's awareness expanded to fill every corner of the flight deck. Each sound carried meaning now. The muted whir of ventilation, the soft click of relays, the subtle changes in engine tone as thrust adjusted. These were not noises to her. They were language, and the aircraft was speaking constantly. Weather data refreshed across the display, revealing instability closer to the diversion point than initially projected. Wind shear indicators flickered briefly before stabilizing again. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to demand respect. The margin narrowed further. She recalculated descent profiles, factoring in weight, fuel burn, and atmospheric density. The aircraft was heavy, still carrying fuel meant for a much longer journey. Landing too fast or too steep could be unforgiving. The runway ahead existed, but claiming it safely would require discipline without compromise. The unconscious pilot's condition remained unchanged. Breathing persisted, fragile but steady. Medical intervention would have to wait. Survival now depended less on recovery and more on containment. The cockpit had become a triage unit for both man and machine. The co-pilot's focus remained divided, yet steadier now. External coordination progressed, but unpredictability lingered. Systems could fail. Weather could worsen. Human endurance had limits. Every plan held an expiration date. The woman's hands rested lightly near the controls, fingers relaxed, yet ready. She did not rush adjustments. She anticipated them. Every input was made before necessity became urgency. This was how accidents were prevented, not by heroics, but by anticipation. Beyond the cockpit door, awareness began to spread more openly. The cabin no longer felt routine. Passengers sensed descent without announcement. Ears popping, stomachs shifting slightly. Concern replaced boredom. Eyes lifted from screens. Whispers multiplied, low and restrained, as if fear itself understood the danger of becoming loud. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, posture composed, expression neutral, offering reassurance without explanation. Professional calm served as the last barrier between order and panic. Still, questions formed silently in every row. The aircraft passed through a layer of uneven air, turbulence briefly rattling overhead bins. The woman compensated instantly, smoothing the ride before fear could fully take shape. The plane obeyed, but the effort cost focus. Each correction consumed attention that could not be reclaimed. Clouds swallowed the horizon, reducing visibility to gray gradients and shifting textures. Outside references vanished. Instrument flying became absolute truth. Trust moved fully from sight to data. The woman adjusted approach parameters, aligning with the projected glide path long before the runway would appear. Precision now determined survival. There would be no second attempt, no margin for dramatic correction at the last second. This descent would succeed or fail on preparation alone. A warning light blinked briefly, then steadied. A system fluctuation, minor but notable. She acknowledged it, rerouting workload mentally, redistributing attention without panic. Systems were designed to fail gracefully, but only if guided. The co-pilot's breathing grew audible, not panicked, but strained. Cognitive fatigue pressed harder now, invisible yet dangerous. The woman compensated by absorbing more of the workload, maintaining balance without overt control transfer. Coordination continued without words. The aircraft dropped through another 1,000 feet. Pressure shifted again. Somewhere in the cabin, someone gripped an armrest a little tighter. The woman visualized the runway repeatedly, despite not yet seeing it. Length, slope, surrounding terrain. She replayed contingency plans, rejecting some, refining others. A missed approach was theoretically possible, but practically disastrous. Fuel margins would not support indecision. The unconscious pilot stirred again, a shallow movement that triggered a brief spike of hope, quickly suppressed. Hope was not actionable. Control was. Rain began to streak across the windshield, light at first, then steadier. Visibility reduced further. Wind indicators adjusted, showing crosswinds building beyond ideal limits. Not impossible, but demanding. The aircraft would not forgive sloppy alignment. She recalibrated final approach speed, factoring in gusts. Too slow risked stall. Too fast risked runway overrun. Numbers mattered now more than ever. The cabin felt quieter than before, fear dampening sound. Even children sensed the gravity, voices hushed, movements restrained. 275 lives leaned unconsciously. Toward the front of the aircraft. Toward the unseen hands guiding them. At 5,000 feet, terrain awareness systems chimed softly, confirming proximity to the Earth. The ground was rising to meet them now, indifferent and absolute. The woman's focus sharpened further, eliminating distraction entirely. Past, future, consequence, all narrowed into the present second. This was where preparation either proved its worth or exposed its absence. Runway lights flickered faintly through the rain, distant and fragile, but real. The first external confirmation of a possible ending appeared ahead. Relief did not come with it. Only responsibility intensified. The aircraft aligned carefully, nose correcting against the wind, descent rate stable but unforgiving. Every correction was smaller now, more precise, more costly if wrong. At this altitude, mistakes were no longer recoverable. The woman's grip tightened slightly, Not from fear, but from commitment. She had carried the flight this far. Now gravity would demand its due. As the runway grew larger, rushing upward through rain and cloud, the aircraft crossed the final threshold between survival, as theory and survival as action. The next moments would decide everything, and with the ground closing fast beneath them, there would be no room left for doubt, only execution. The runway filled the windshield, no longer an abstract concept or a distant plan, but a physical truth rushing toward them through rain and wind. Lights stretched forward in precise alignment, glowing against wet asphalt like a narrow promise. The aircraft descended steadily, heavy yet responsive. Every system now operating at the edge of acceptable limits. The woman's world narrowed to speed, angle, and alignment. Wind pushed from the side, testing discipline. The nose corrected gently, not fighting the force, but cooperating with it. Control was no longer about strength. It was about restraint. Too much input would be as dangerous as none at all. The rain intensified, drumming against the fuselage, blurring external reference points. Instrument readings became law. Airspeed held. Descent rate stable. The engines responded with measured thrust, neither strained nor idle. The aircraft was listening, but only because it was being spoken to correctly. Inside the cockpit, silence reigned, broken only by system tones and the muted breath of two humans carrying an impossible weight. The unconscious pilot remained secured, still alive, still fragile. The co-pilot's posture was rigid, eyes fixed outward, mind braced for impact. Whether smooth or catastrophic, the woman adjusted power slightly. The aircraft responded instantly, sinking into the glide path with renewed obedience. This was the last opportunity for correction. Beyond this point, physics would take over completely. In the cabin, fear had matured into acceptance. No one spoke. No one cried out. Hands were clasped, eyes closed, breaths shallow. 275 people felt the descent now, felt the nearness of the ground, felt the fragile truth that survival was no longer guaranteed, only possible. The runway threshold rushed beneath them. The woman eased the nose upward at precisely the right moment. Not dramatic, not delayed, the aircraft responded, bleeding off speed as gravity reached upward. Tires met wet asphalt with a solid, unmistakable contact. The impact was firm, controlled, real. For a split second, nothing else existed. Then the reverse thrust engaged, engines roaring not in panic but in purpose. Deceleration pressed bodies forward against restraints. The aircraft stayed aligned, tracking straight despite wind and rain, despite weight and momentum. The woman held steady, guiding the machine through its final test. Brakes applied smoothly, not aggressively. Systems cooperated. The runway rushed past, lights blurring, water spraying outward in wide arcs. Speed dropped, rapidly, then steadily. The aircraft slowed enough to breathe again. When the plane finally rolled to a controlled stop, silence flooded the cockpit, heavy and absolute. The engines wound down, their roar fading into the background hum of rain and cooling metal. For a moment, no one moved. Then reality returned all at once. The co-pilot exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. His hands trembled as tension released its grip. The unconscious pilot stirred again, stronger this time, a faint sign of recovery that no longer carried the weight of immediate survival. In the cabin, it took a few seconds for understanding to arrive. Then, it spread like light breaking through cloud. People realized they were still alive. A sound rose, not loud at first, but layered. Gasps, shaky laughter, quiet sobs, hands covering faces, strangers clinging to one another without words. Relief did not explode. It poured out slowly, deeply, as fear finally loosened its hold. The aircraft had landed. 275 lives had been returned to the ground. Emergency crews approached through the rain, lights flashing, procedures unfolding with practiced efficiency. The plane was no longer alone. The sky had released them. The woman remained seated for a moment longer, hands resting lightly near the controls that no longer mattered. Her breathing slowed. Only now did the weight reach her, settling into muscles and bones. She had not felt heroic. She had felt necessary. The cockpit door opened wider as assistance arrived. Questions would come later. Reports, explanations, scrutiny. But in this moment, none of that existed. What existed was survival. The unconscious pilot was attended to quickly, removed with care. His life, like the others, had been preserved by timing systems. and a decision made without hesitation. The woman finally stood, stepping back from the flight deck. As she entered the cabin, eyes turned toward her not with curiosity, but with something deeper, recognition without names, gratitude without language. She did not seek it. She did not absorb it. She walked back toward seat 12C, moving through the narrow aisle as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Her steps were steady, her expression calm. At 35,000 feet, when one system failed and fear threatened to spread faster than information, a woman chose responsibility over hesitation. She used knowledge when it was needed most. She acted without being asked. She carried lives she would never fully know. She did not save the plane alone. Machines worked. Training mattered. Chance played its part. But she made the difference between drift and direction, between falling and landing, between loss and life. Seat 12C would one day be occupied again by someone else, unaware of what had once happened there. The aircraft would fly again. The sky would remain vast and indifferent. But for 275 people, that flight would never fade into routine. Because on that day, in that storm, at the edge of gravity's demand, the sky gave them back to the ground. And they lived